Hi, folks. My name's Billy Forisha. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I was a professor for several years. And this presentation will be followed by a discussion led by one of my former doctoral students, and he'll introduce himself. And I want to introduce, before I get started, I want to introduce my technical advisor, who's sitting right here. And I just move this over, and you can see him. And he's interested in this topic. And he's also has a lot more experience with this sort of thing than I do. Um, so the name of this presentation is Goldilocks and the Three Epistemologies. It's going to be a little longer than I anticipated. So it'll be probably about an hour and 15 minutes, and that'll be followed by uh, the discussion among yourselves. So I've been interested in epistemology before I ever knew what the word meant, because I've been worried about these kinds of things as far as I can remember. I'm going all the back to childhood. Um, so without further ado, we'll move on into this topic. This one, right? Um, Among cultural differences, I know that's the theme of the conference, as I remember. Among cultural differences are those having to do with epistemology. And we sort of don't think about that as it being a cultural phenomenon, but I'm going to make a case for epistemology is very much of a cultural phenomenon. And the question is, what is, people wonder what epistemology is. Well, according to Eric Fromm, who was one of my first people I ever read, who was in the field of psychology, uh, a marvelous thinker, he identified five universal needs, and one of those was the need for a frame of reference. It's how do we relate to the environment? How do we conceive the environment? How do we know what we know, essentially? And one of my favorite playwrights, Peter Schaefer, who I recommend his film or his play Equus to you. It's a fantastic play about the psychotherapy with an adolescent, and he called this the psychiatrist in the movie calls it a way of seeing in the dark. And then the philosopher James Ferrier in the middle of the 19th century, um, I mean 18th century, no, I mean 19th century, called it epistemology. That is a meta theory of how we arrive at what we believe to be true. That is what we believe to be congruent with reality. So most people don't think about what it is, how they derive their ideas, and what when they're interacting with the world, they end up assuming that the way they're interacting is the way the world is, that that's reality. But in fact, there's a process involved in that. So we're going to be looking at some of the consequences of that. Of course, um, basically, I'm making a case that involves the exchange of cultural capital, which one of my favorite writers also, Thomas Sowell, who's at Stanford University, he has written a trilogy of three marvelous books on the exchange of cultural capital between different groups in the world. And he also agrees with other writers who say that that's a very stressful process, and especially between groups that are disparate in levels of power, of political military power. In the last 500 years or so, this stress has probably greatly increased because there's also a lot more variety in epistemology than there used to be. And but one way of seeing the dark derives from the European Enlightenment, and that was the beginning of what is now the dominant epistemology in the Western world. And it came at a time when the Western world began to preempt other competing models and tended to dominate them and use force and power to do that. Oscar Handlin was an American historian, and he's trying to support people such as immigrants from the developing countries, and reminding us that the way people come to information, the content of the information, and the way people come, that is their epistemology, that people are not blank tablets, that you can just suddenly go into a new environment or something, and suddenly a new culture, is ready for you. You erase the old one and you describe a new one. And that in fact, both our epistemologies, which is the process of learning anything, as well as the content that we learn it, just follows us for a long time, and it's handed down from one family to another. So it can be hundreds of years old. I'm going to stand up because my whole career, I'm standing up while teaching, not sitting looking at a camera. And so I'm just going to continue, and my associate here will move this around. So go ahead, and you want to use that and change it there. Okay. So I don't mean to oversimplify human history. A lot of other things are going on, but one of the things that's going on is this exchange process between epistemologies. And so one of the things I want to do is to elucidate what are the essential differences in contemporary epistemologies, and how do they separate caregivers, if they separate caregivers and recipients of that care. How might these differences impact the work being undertaken in the consulting room? And that's the part that I hope that you will be discussing when this presentation is all over with. How can you use any of this information to empower you in your work as a therapist and your relationship with your clients? Let's go ahead. But first, before we get into more about this, I want to play one of my favorite games, the why game. I just love it when you get 4, 5, and 6 years old, and they're asking you why this and why that, and it goes on forever. Why? Well, I like it too when students in graduate school ask the why game, and that's probably my favorite game anyhow. So why is epistemology a need? Eric Fromm, one of my favorite writers and lecturers, I heard him when I was a graduate student. Why is it a need? People don't go around thinking epistemology is a need. Oh, so he declared it was, and I tend to agree with him. Another question, why are so many of us seemingly virtually addicted to our own primary epistemology? We tend to, even if we're kind of fluid in our thinking, we usually have one that's more primary than others. And why does it seem like almost an addiction, so that we even have to have a lecture on it like this? Why are we even concerned with it? Or you can bring it down to the level of our work. Why do conflicting epistemologies ruin Thanksgiving dinners, which they did in my family growing up a lot, or sometimes support people killing each other? I teach a course called falls under the rubric of psychohistory. There's actually an International Psychohistory Association, headquarters at New York University, and every year they have a conference, and many of my doctoral students presented their dissertations and their research at that particular organization, because we were looking at how the things we were studying, how systems theory, which we're all familiar with, how systems theory can be applied not just to families, but all, in Bronfenbrenner's entire network of different levels, including the worldwide level and where nation states interact with each other. Many of those interactions are hardly different than the ones you run into in family therapy. I've often thought that State Department should be hiring not Democrats, well, that's true, but who been hiring family therapists as ambassadors, or at least the consultants to ambassadors. Maybe that's the next level in our profession. Go ahead, thank you. So I have an answer to the why question, and this will be the first time I've actually introduced this particular topic and given an answer to that question. But I think the reason is pretty obvious, so I don't mean to belabor the point. But I think it's because epistemologies operate as a management system for anxiety. So let's just start with anxiety, and then we'll come back to when we come back, we'll come back to the three bears. Okay. Um, First of all, anxiety is universal and it's unavoidable. And I think I'll just go like this. I'll just come up and do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I call this the cycle of creativity and the role of wisdom, because we as a species, inevitably, there's no way out of it. We experience anxiety. And that's because the, the phenomena that characterizes our species, that makes us really different, that the phenomena that has survival value in the course of evolution is actually one particular aspect of our lives, and that's the fact that we have the capacity for creativity. Other animals live in a domain of primarily instinct. We also live in that domain, but it's not the only domain we live in. It's not the only thing going on with us. We are a form of DNA that evolved, who knows why, evolved because it has survival value to act on the environment, not just to adapt to the environment. We go beyond adapting to the environment. We adapt the environment to suit us. Every time you put on in the wintertime, you change and you're wearing a really nice warm jacket around, that's an example of changing the environment, changing your wardrobe, changing you and the way you go out, the way you dress, you inventing that in order to go in the weather when you want to. And the same thing is true about all the kinds of things that we have created. Creativity occurs and maintains itself as a process because it has survival value in terms of the theory of evolution. When people undergo an active creativity, whether it's in their mind, Einstein used to talk about his thought experiments, whether it's in your mind or whether it's out doing something in the environment, it's the time you have it, either privately or in action, it actualizes the experience of freedom and individuation. It wasn't until I read, I struggle with the notion of whether we are really free or not. That's when it's freedom of reality. And you can go on YouTube and see all kinds of debates on this, some really interesting debates, whether we really are free or not. I came to the conclusion some time ago, reading a number of different people, that freedom is a reality at an experiential level. At the phenomenological level of our being, freedom is a reality because we experience it intensely, makes it real. It's happening on this planet. And I think it's real because you can't have creativity as your primary means to define your species without freedom. So we have the experience of freedom, even if it's some small level of being in the world with protons and quantum and all that, that it maybe it's an illusion. We experience it so intensely that it's real to us as a motivator. Along with that comes individuation, because the moment of creation, when we're having it, we feel very individualized. This is like, wow, we are ourselves and we're doing something, we're acting. This may produce meaning, and if it's useful to other people, that meaning can spread. It means to us, and it means something to others. And if it has prosperity for all associated with it, then it may be adopted for others. But while we're in the process we've created, we don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know that it's going to be useful to anybody. We don't know how long the creativity process will last. However, so because of that, not only is freedom and some joy and excitement associated with it, like when you are in a creative mode, this process also, dialectically speaking, in terms of movement back and forth between polar opposites, highlights a sense of isolation. Individuation eventually turns into isolation. we don't know whether what we're producing, what we're creating is going to be useful to anybody. And suddenly the notion of futility sets in. Because what if it's not? What if it's rejected? Futility is set in. And then we also know that no matter how creative we can become, and no matter how exciting that process is, no matter how much the fruits of our creativity might be accepted by other people, we also become aware of our of our actually impending death at sometimes. We become aware of death because to be aware, to experience creativity is a heightened awareness of space and time. So we're occupying a particular space at a particular moment in the history of our planet and our species and the universe itself. And we move in that space. We move, it changes. We're changing things when we create things. Are different now. Space is different. Time is different. And by reflection, those differences that we're in charge of changing remind us ourselves that we will change, that we are changing, and ultimately we die. So we become aware of death, we become aware of loneliness, we became aware of the possibility of futility. All of those things haunt us, even in the process of what brings us joy and meaning through the creative action. They go hand in hand. Any one of those things, isolation, futility, death, or any one of those by themselves evokes experience of anxiety. And hence, that's why it's universal. It goes with the territory. Being a human being feels and thinks, it feels like a wonderful thing as everything's going right. We are the creative beings. The price we pay, however, is that we experience anxiety. Anxiety is basically fear, which is a good thing. You don't stay alive without fear, I mean, as all of you know. I mean, that's every single animal that you can possibly encounter experiences fear if it has any kind of neurological system. The spider on your floor, as soon as you walk into the kitchen, feels it moving, the vibration. It may not see you, but it knows something is there, and it gets away from you right away before you can step on it or something. Because so people do have all beings have this emotional reactivity of fear. But human beings, which have the ability to move forward in time, imagine things in time, because because that's how we've evolved. That's part of creativity. This time and space experience that evokes fear in the present of something that might happen in the future. And so it's future oriented. Anxiety is anticipation of things going wrong, and you feel it in the moment. And sometimes it's overwhelming, and sometimes it's just moderate. But in any case, you cannot continue in this circle of creativity, and end up with wisdom unless you find a way of managing anxiety. And that's essential. What's interesting is we use the same process, the creative process, to come up with ways which manage anxiety. So the very thing that causes the anxiety is also, the solution to it. And those solutions, like everything else we might create, are also handed down in culture. Culture is not only made up of the things we create in terms of our ideas, it's also full of ways of managing the anxiety that goes with producing those ideas. So creativity is, produces the fear, the anxiety, and also solves the problem, supposedly. But one of the major ways in which that happens is through epistemology. People have belief systems about how they know what they know. And they get that primarily from their families through their culture. And probably I would guess it's the primary thing that's going on in culture. Epistemology is probably the ground piece in culture. And when I start talking about the different epistemologies, the main ones that are competing with each other, you'll see what I mean. Now, I want to move on just a moment with this. It's usually not part of my lecture on the epistemologies, but there's a way of successful management This idea comes from Murray Bowen. Successful management anxiety comes from finding a balance between yourself as an individual. I'm adding to this idea. You're individual, you're experiencing self as a creative being, finding a balance between that and being a member of any particular social group or family. And the differentiation of self is not, in my mind, it's not a call for highly intense individuality. It's calling for balance between the capacity for being yourself and also being in a group. That ability to go back and forth between being involved with others and also stepping back and experiencing yourself independently of others. And that's where that way creativity and the dialectics of isolation, futility, and death awareness, they all work out more in balance with each other. You learn how to live in balance. It's almost like when you're a kid and you're on a seesaw, you feel the other person on the other end and the weight that they carry in the process, and you find a way of balancing. If you don't have any fun on a seesaw. Basically, it's a much more fun thing to be able to live in balance with other people. So it's like a dance. I think of it as a dance. Virginia Satir thought about it as a dance, that you move back and forth between relationships and individuality. I think this is what Bowen was talking about. Now, that's a learning process. And that is also informed by, the way to do that is informed by culture. However, culture, when it comes up with an idea like this or a way to help you with managing anxiety, tends to become rather rigid over time while the world around you is changing in a dynamic fashion. So being able to assess whether those epistemologies or whatever it might be is working for you requires you to be circumspective. And that's an individual action. That's being your own creative person. And you basically are being challenged to manage anxiety. And according to Bowen, using my terms though right here, it's either going to, if what you're doing is the way you are managing your epistemology, yields more isolation, despair, it's probably going to decrease prosperity even. It's probably not going to work for you, and it's going to lead in a circle, and it's going to lead to more despair. So what happens in your next cycle, and you can't get off this cycle until you die. This is kind of a permanent thing, but you can either move around it with more wisdom, or you can move around it in greater despair. And I think this is the reason that ultimately anxiety is the cause of depression. As all of you know, depression is the number one presenting symptom in therapy. And it comes from people who I think it's the origins of the depression on a psychological level. I'm not going to get into discussion of the biological level. But on the psychological level, things are not working. You're not coming up with ideas about reality, about the process of creativity. It's not working for you. But you can tell when you get more into despair and it's going like that, you need to take a stop. You need to stop and figure out what's going on because you're not managing anxiety in a way that supports creativity and individuation, etc. So if it's yielding inclusion and happiness, wisdom increases, it reinforces, and you're experiencing yourself as being wise, and that goes in to govern your next cycle. So this is a process. It's very much a process, and any of us can get caught and thrown off. Any of us can go either direction. But the more you learn to balance on the seesaw that Bowen was talking about, the more you're probably going to come out on the side of the next round on the circle of creativity will probably work for you. You'll be able to keep a balance between you and other people. You'll be able to manage even death anxiety because you feel like you're contributing something that's meaningful and you're finding balance and belongingness needs. Now, that's another whole aspect of this. And usually I spend another hour on this very subject because of that. But because I want to get back to epistemologies, I'll move along here. But anxiety, managing anxiety is applicable to also both creating and using epistemologies. Okay, now we're just talking about epistemologies. So, I'm assuming everyone here knows this story. I found out last year when I was in Ukraine, I was giving lectures at two universities there, that everybody there knew this story. And then one of them, or two people over there, told me that this story about the three bears I thought it came from the United States. Actually, I thought people in Texas were the ones that knew about this story because I brought up in Texas, and you may not know, but a lot of Texans believe that they are the center of the universe. I thought that until I left Texas and moved to San Francisco, and I realized there are other places in the universe besides Texas. Anyway, when I was in Eastern Europe, I was amazed at how many of our child stories that we learn as children are actually been told for generations in other countries. So when I asked an audience of about 200 people there, are you familiar with the story of the three bears? They all knew it, and they thought it was a silly question for me to ask. Anyway, what's happening here? So here, the last part of the story, Goldilocks, she tries out the porridge and all that, and she ends up trying out the bed, so she's in the bedroom and she's asleep. She found the bed that was just right for her, just like she finally found the soup that was right for us. In the meantime, the three bears come home and they're shocked to find this golden-haired young lady sleeping in their bed. And they immediately want an explanation for the unknown. Here's a mystery. What could it be? How do you explain this mystery? How do you approach it? How do you know is basically at stake here. The question of how do we know what we know is at stake. And Baby Bear has spontaneously an answer. She's an angel. Right away, she's an angel. That explains the whole thing. It explains why she's here. She's an angel. But Daddy Bear here, Father Bear, has a different approach, and he thinks, grow up, Junior. There is no such thing. There is no such thing. And so he's putting Baby Bear down with his explanation. No, that explanation is no good. There is no such thing. And then Mama Bear says, are you so sure, Honey Bear? Am I not your angel of the morning? Remember that song? And so she's introducing another way of looking at this. So here we have the three bears, the victims of this visitation, unexpected visitation. They're not challenging each other's epistemologies. So what I want to do is look at the three contemporary epistemologies. The conflicts between them are causing all kinds of havoc in the modern world, and they're going to enter your space. I think, and you guys can talk about this after I get off, whether you think that's true or not. It's going to enter in the consulting room. I mean, it even enters in. Look at every one of you. Go to meetings and conferences, or you're looking for a job. Everybody or the insurance company, they all want to make sure that your practice, the way your practice is empirically based practice. That's the demand. It's interesting. That's the demand. So that means that your epistemology is required for your work. At the same time, in the last several years, and I'm not knocking this, I'm glad of it, at the same time, you're being admonished and you might be fired or not hired if you don't display it. Cultural humility. It's written exactly, cultural humility. You go out and look for any kind of job, teaching or clinical work, and you will see that cultural humility, the capacity for cultural humility is required. At the same time, practicing with epistemologically, empirically based, ways of working are also required. So that kind of says you have got to fit into one epistemology, but find a way of being humble about it so that you can accommodate the other epistemologies. I find that difficult and I find it strange. I hope that you will discuss this part. How do you do both? How do you absolutely, how does the profession demand both? You be this way, but be humble about it. You know, be humble about it. You do have to find a way, I think, to be humble about it. At the same time, is it absolutely, how absolute do you have to be to be, I mean, to have one epistemological? I mean, is it really possible to do something different? And I hope that that's what comes out of this presentation, at least a little bit, at least to think about and have a discussion. So what are the three competing epistemologies in the world today? These are, remember, these are cultural phenomena, which means their primary existence has to do eventually with our ability to manage anxiety. That's why I went over all that first. This is about the competition between management systems in terms of anxiety. Well, let's look at the one that's the oldest and probably more people ascribe to around the world than any other. And it's called pre-modernism. That's because modernism is generally a word given for the last 500 years of European Western history, in which I'll say in a moment and go into that, how that modernism has tended to prevail. Pre-modernism is what came before that. So what is it? What's going on in how come pre-modernism lasted so long? You basically at least 70,000 years. Human beings, Homo sapiens, if you read Yuval Harari's book Sapiens, which I highly recommend. By the way, I'll give a plug for that book, and I'll give a plug for Obama when he was president. After he was president, somebody interviewed him, what's the most important book that you read while you were president? Because he was well known for reading a lot. And he said Sapiens by Yuval Harari. It made me feel really good because I was requiring it in my classes at the time. And I still think it's one of the best books ever. Yuval Harari picks out 70,000 years ago is about the time when hominids, there were several of them alive at the same time, which is what we are, they begin to become more and more and more creative. And eventually that Homo sapiens took that, and that's the route we are, and we are Homo sapiens. And we outlived all the other hominid groups. And you know, it's not necessarily a happy story because Yuval Harari also mentions the fact that we may be the species we started history with our creativity. We recorded our history with also our creativity and learning to write and use languages. But we also may be the species to end it because the whole experiment of awareness and creativity and the use of epistemologies and all those things may come to an end because it may be a dead end. Evolution, the process of evolution it's better to think of it, I think, as being an ongoing hypothesis. It's an ongoing experiment. Let me put it that way. It's an ongoing, never-ending experiment, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be. According to one source on this, there are more species that have become extinct, or 3 or 4 times more species that have existed and have become extinct than presently exist. And probably, according to Yuval Harari, he thinks that we will be the ones to end history because history is the writing of ourselves. Okay, back to pre-modernism. Pre-modernism, what is it about? Well, first of all, it's the people who experience it, the people who come from this, they think of it as a felt true. It's a big T. It's truth with a big T. It's really the truth. And it's felt intensely. And it relieves anxiety like crazy and most of the time. So I think I'm going to sit down because the screen is a little bit easier to read if I'm going to follow it. But I promise not just to read it word for word. So pre-modernism, this felt truth has some characteristics. First of all, relative to the other two epistemologies that we'll look at, it's very automatically accessed. It's fast. It's definitely multi-generational, and it's almost comes quickly and relatively speaking. It does not require a lot of hard work, and it feels incredibly good. It can relieve anxiety like nobody's business. It has several upsides in that regard. First of all, it's extremely intuitive. It relies on intuition. And anybody who's a therapist realizes that, the two most important things that make therapy going, I think, are the ability to empathize and the ability to be intuitive and take action on both. You put empathy together with intuitive learning and knowledge, and you're able to act. I think that's uh, I think that's really, really important, and being able to do that. That's why I think that actually, in the debate between science and art, I think psychotherapy is more of an art, and and it relies on a lot of knowledge from science, but when it's being practiced, it's more like art than science. Um, Therefore, it'd be hard for me to get a job in today's world because I'm not 100% empirically based in my thinking. I value intuition. I value the art of it. I value the subjective. The next thing up, the another upside is it's subjective. It's intensely subjective, that pre-modernism is. It gives meaning very quickly. If you buy whatever the particular pieces of information are in any particular style of pre-modernism, it's provides meaning, and that the meaning that it provides is held up over a whole lot of cultural evolution. Culture evolves just like physical evolution. If something comes along, if an idea comes along, it's been created and it's been accepted by the group, then it is increasingly relied upon because it produces results, which is managing anxiety. So it's selected in the evolutionary process, just like a cell in your body. I mean, if it helps you survive, it'll be replicated because you are living long enough to reproduce. It's the same process. Evolution is about whatever exists, whether it's an idea, whether it's a feeling, whether it's a way of seeing in the dark, or whether it's a way of digesting your food, is whatever works to keep you alive, allowing you to repeat it, has survival value. And being intuitive, subjective, and meaningful has a lot of survival value. Another upside is it's intra-tribally related. It involves relationships. It brings people close together on an intertribal basis so that people have enough other cultural phenomena in common, they will find it much easier to relate. And we know from the work of Alfred Adler and many others, being able to live in relationship with other people, oh, that's fantastic. Not only does it relieve you of anxiety and manage that anxiety, it encourages creativity because the group wants you to be creative on behalf of all of them and also yourself. So it has incredible level of relational value. And as you get older, and as you're threatened by the environment, or you get a disease, or ending up being faced with the challenges of staying alive, it also is helpful, comforting, and it's also intellectual. It's scholastically intellectual. Scholastically means it has a whole lots of ideas and complications that challenge your intellect. You won't get bored with it. It's various, pre-modernism is broken into different belief systems. One belief system will characterize one group of people, another one will characterize another. What they have in common are the processes of pre-modernism, but the actual content can differ. And the results of the scholastic endeavors are different, and each one of them is a different kind of creativity, an intellectual creativity going on. And they're fascinating and interesting and, satisfying to people who like to make those kind of example. I mean, I like to travel a lot. I love going to other churches. I love to go into museums and what have you, and feel it. What are people thinking? How did they come out of these ideas? You don't even have to travel to do that except to go down the street. Now, there are downsides to every one of these epistemologies. There are downsides. If there were no downsides, there would be no competition between them. We wouldn't be having this lecture. It would just be, one epistemology, and that would be it. We wouldn't even need to worry about it. But every one of them have an upside and every one of them have a downside. It would seem to me. These are my thoughts on the subject. The downside of felt truth being the primary means by which you know the world, the primary processes of knowing the world, as it puts you at high risk for being an authoritarian type of way of being in the world. It becomes hierarchical, becomes authoritarian. Whatever scholastic kinds of things have been developed over the course of years, the intellectual ideas, they're a hierarchy of people have been created who have the time and the spare time to do this. They're actually supported by the work of other people to do these kinds of things, and they become the knowers, and they hold the kinds of things that you need to know to feel comfortable in your particular way of being a pre-modernist. And they're they're hierarchical. They tend to be close-minded. They will allow some levels of struggle, but it tends to be close-minded. This reminds me just recently, I mean, obviously, the best examples of pre-modernism, but not the only ones, is probably religion. And if you notice lately, we had a new pope, and he took the name of Leo. And he took that because he is trying to live at the borderline of flexibility, I think. This is my interpretation. Because Leo the 13th, the last Leo was Leo the 13th, and Leo the 13th did a most incredible thing, not without pressure. I know I'm kind of moving away from the point, but it's an incredibly good example. And France had already gone through one revolution, and the first French Revolution that ended up cutting, having what's called the Terror, in which people were getting their heads cut off right and left while people were clapping and celebrating and drinking and sewing at the site of where people were getting their heads cut off. And all that evolved into dictatorship of Napoleon. Not a very successful revolution, even though the ideas were fantastic and we have inherited them, but the French themselves had a hard time putting them into place. There were three more revolutions. There were the third one was around 1870, and there was a group of 13 priests from Lyon and Paris who decided to go and have a sit-in in Rome with the papacy. They refused to go home and leave unless they had an audience with the Pope. And they had an idea and they wanted to present it to Pope Leo the 13th. And after a lot of work on their part, like they were there, as I recall, for over a year. And finally, he gave them an audience. Finally, he listened to them. And what they had to say was this basically, look, we're going to have, the French people obviously want a democracy, but the people in the rural areas don't feel free to participate in it because it's in conflict with their religion, with the Catholic religion, i.e., it's in conflict with their primary epistemology. Is there something you can do about this? And Leo the 13th issued a famous encyclical in which he decided, and in my own opinion, I did a lot of work on this subject, by the way, when I was a history major. I spent an entire year on this subject, writing a paper on this, and I was amazed when the Pope chose Leo. No one's chose Leo since Leo 13. Leo the 13th said, okay, to these 13 priests, he said, okay, it's okay for Catholics to take part in a democracy. Heretofore, monarchy's been our primary uh, kind of government that we have liked. It's just authoritarian and inspired, by God, and having a king that's divine right and all that stuff. We're willing to give that up and move ahead. It's okay to participate in a democracy as long as Catholics don't participate in the creation of a democracy. Well, it's like, okay, leave that to the people, I guess, who are willing to have a revolution, even if it costs their lives or costs the lives of other people. But once it's in place, it would be okay to be a democratic. I think that decision saved the Catholic Church, not only in France, but ultimately all over South America, because there were lots of revolutions to follow. And the French finally had a successful revolution. After 70 years of trying to have a revolution that was become democratic, they finally succeeded because the people in the countryside, which is the majority of people, could support it. That was my conclusion in my paper. So why did I go into all those details? Because it illustrates how difficult it is, when you have an epistemology that is really defined, hierarchical nature, and basically on the downside of it tends to be closed-minded and finding it very hard to change and adjust to the changing world. It's it's not intertribal, it's intratribal. That's a good thing because it brings us all together, but it also separates us from people who are not in our tribe. Um, By the way, there's a really good book called Moral Tribes by a fellow in the Happiness Project. Sorry, but it's Jeffrey Green. And I highly recommend Moral Tribes. He's talking about the same phenomena. So it tends to be excluding other tribes from access to the belief, although at the same time wanting to be evangelical and convince them because the more people who end up agreeing with your particular epistemology, the more secure you feel in that. And it will increase your sense of managing anxiety if you can get lots of other people to believe it. If the number of people believing it go down, your anxiety will increase because you begin to question it. Another downside is it's irrational. It does not value necessarily evidence of empirical nature, and it tends to be intolerant of ambiguity. Now, that doesn't mean all the people who practice this are intolerant of ambiguity, nor are they irrational, because scholasticism is very rational. But generally speaking, when empiricism, which we're going to talk about next, comes along, it tends in the world of in terms of what it produces, it tends to have more power for creativity and producing things that people want than scholasticism does. Scholasticism doesn't tend to change. It tends to continually repeat the same kinds of things. So pre-modernism is in a tough struggle with modernism and has been for about the last 500 years. So now let's talk about modernism. Uh, Modernism is about truth. Every one of these is about truth. What is truth? And what is what you have and what you feel and the way you work? Is it true? Is your epistemology true? Modernism talks about truth with a small t, not a big T, because in modernism, truth is nearly always hypothetical. It's hypothetical. It's more about probability than it is about facts and truth. Truth meaning something that doesn't change, that really is. There are people, of course, who are in modernism, your family doctor who talks to you and gives you advice as if it was true. He might be feeling or she might be feeling it's true, and you feel like it's true. But at the level of creativity, it's nearly always probability, not truth. Because the key word about modernism in terms of epistemology is hypothetical. It's hypothetical and it can be testable. It can be tested and it might move up or down in terms of probability. It's also empirical. Boy, there is a big difference. It's empirical. It lends itself to examination, and it lends itself to research, and lends itself to empirical research in particular. So it's not unlike pre-modernism, it's not a automatically accessed. Doesn't automatically just come and do work for you. It's a slow process, very slow, and it changes all the time. During COVID in this country, so many people became just disgusted with modernism. They didn't call it that, but they began to dislike doctors and dislike, the agencies, dislike and distrusting them because they changed their mind too much. It was like, well, last week he said such and such, and now they're saying this, you know, and now they're creating a vaccine so fast. I thought they needed to be slower. It's like all these complaints about it, and it is a slow process. It's slow. I've often thought, why here, I'm getting older. I wish they'd hurry up and solve this, this, and this, because I'm going to need it soon. But it's slow. It's slow process. I went to a ceremony this morning, a beautiful, beautiful chorus of people who had Alzheimer's who were singing together because they could music they could still listen to and remember songs that they heard with children. It was absolutely beautiful, and there was not a dry eye in the group there. It was beautiful. But I'm saying, when are they going to get this solved? Well, it's a slow process. Maybe AI will make it faster. On the other hand, I have my own fears about AI. I'm not going to do in this particular lecture. So the upsides are it's rational. And the number one upside for this, the number one people even tolerate it, is it's highly useful. Modernism is like it keeps up with change. It creates change and then keeps up with change, more or less. It's useful. And it introduces the capacity for objectivity. Wow, that we're still aware of ourselves in time and space, but now we can actually become objective about ourselves. We can examine ourselves. We can view ourselves in time and space. We can view other people. We can step aside from subjective primary experience and comment on the experience that we're having. And of course, this is what we ask people to do in therapy all the time. It's just fundamental. I do it through the use of Gestalt therapy. When I do double chair work, in one chair, the person is fully subjectively what's going on. Like, I hate my mother, I hate my father, what a bastard he was, da da da, and hit that chair or whatever and get angry. And then they go to the other chair and they give a voice to the person they've been angry at. I love Gestalt therapy. And they listen to that, and a dialogue is created between the two. And then they go to the third chair where they are in charge of the conflict between the other two chairs, between their mother and their father, for instance. They are using their capacity for objectivity to change their whole perception of the reality about themselves in relationship to their family. That's self-correcting. That's another upside. This approach to therapy is self-correcting. It's somewhat inclusive because it does not care where you came from, how much money you have, what's the color of your skin, your accent you have. They just want to know if you get the job done. Do you get the job done of using hypotheses and using empirical research to prove your hypotheses or to increase the probability of it being useful? It's self-correcting. And it's somewhat inclusive because it doesn't care about any of those other variables. It's pragmatic as can be. That's the only thing that counts is do you get results? Nothing else counts. And it has a hierarchy, just like pre-modernism does, but it's very fluid. In fact, one person's ideas overthrow another person's ideas, and that's it's called success. It's called progress. And sure, it may hurt for a little while on an emotional level to the person who had their ideas overthrown, but they're all part of this process. It's part of the culture. And so they go on with their lives and then they might turn their next thing over with. So they're constantly both fighting and living with each other peacefully in this thing, intertribally. Sounds like wonderful, doesn't it? But there are downsides. It's also very much at risk for being authoritarian. For everything I just said is more or less true of this group, but it's not fast. People get into a position and they have all the authority. That's why we use the expression, or at least my mother's generation did. I'm really glad we don't do this very much anymore. But my mother and her generation used to say, "Oh, yes, I went to see the doctor, and he put me on such and such." And I always thought, even as a kid, I was like, "He put you on such and such. He put you on aspirin." It's like he put you. It's like, where did you get the sorry to put you? It's like, but now people don't use that expression. I'm glad they don't. Instead, I went to the doctor. He says I probably have this particular thing, and that I might want to try this, and that was my decision. He didn't put me on it. I probably wouldn't like it if he or she tried to do that. It's It tends to also, another downside, it privileges the normative because that's how you increase probability. The more people on the bell curve, you have the middle, two-thirds are in the middle and one-third is split and, on the ends of the bell curve. And so it privileges by its nature, the more successful any particular adventure is, the more it's privileging the normative. Um, That is kind of a downside because and that's why it's so important that you do the research properly, that your sample size is large enough, your sample size, depending on what you're measuring, uh, is not contaminated. In the whatever the DSM-1 when it was first created, lots of complaints from people about it. I was one of those. I wanted to go to graduate school at a place nearby my home and the university I was teaching at, and I got rejected because I took the MMPI, and it turned out that on a particular scale, they have these 10 scales, I think, at the time, and I was outside the normative group on one of them in terms of gender identity. But essentially, I was too feminine from their point of view, so they didn't accept me. And then I got accepted to a place in California, which is really famous and which is much more tolerant of gender identity things. And I had a great time there. The I thought it was just a weird thing that therapists would be taking that test, but they found out the MMPI eventually. They found out that it was apparently I don't know all the story, but it was graduate students doing the setting up the testing of the MMPI, the first one, and it turned out it was normed on rural Minnesotans, most of which were just two or three generations removed from being Scandinavians and very working out in the fields, very masculine kind of work, not going to the library and reading books, or going and doing modern dance classes, So anyway, it privileges the normative tends to be a weakness. On the other hand, you wouldn't get the research being done if they didn't do that. It also has a professional tribalism going on. Trying to do as much to make this not so true in modern clinics. But obviously, they are a group. They're into tribalism. They're into doing this and that, and they are busy at work, and it creates a kind of tribalism. Uh, and because it creates tribalism, and because it's empirical, and even though it's hypothetical, it tends to be ultimately a little bit intolerant of ambiguity. Of course, it's a matter of time, but I matter, people, you have a session with your doctor and you want to start getting into asking questions about, well, how do you know this? How did you come by this? Where's the research for this? They don't like talking to you very much anymore because, it's running up a bill the insurance company may not want to pay for, and they got another person waiting, to come and see. They're not interested in those kind of conversations as much. There's an intolerance of ambiguity operating. And that's similar to pre-modernism. They both are intolerant of ambiguity. It's really interesting, and probably it's the reason why postmodernism came along. I mean, there are several reasons here, but my own hunch is that intolerance of ambiguity is kind of a no-no. I mean, it's very difficult. You hardly can exist in this world without some kind of tolerance of ambiguity because even if you have empirical evidence for something, Well, are you sure about, what the control group was all about? Did they take all these, the guys telling you this, but how well was this research done? And what group was it done on? There's a lot of room for ambiguity, and it tends to be intolerant because it's not going to sell the product as well. I might say, I don't mean literally sell the product, but selling the idea. So postmodernism is something that came along after World War II. Postmodernism trying to solve some of these problems. Pre-modernism and modernism, by the way, were at war with each other for the past 500 years. It's almost intolerable, finding it very difficult to get along with each other. And the more modernism was successful, the more difficult it was for people to remain pre-modern. It was a challenging membership. I read an article just recently that after World War II, something like 40% of people who were raised in a particular religion in this country had, in just two generations, had moved away from that and were no longer in that particular religion that they were in. That's that requires a lot of pain and agony on an epistemological level for people. I went through that agony myself as an undergraduate over these kind of questions between the conflict between modernism and pre-modernism. I was overwhelmed by it as a teenager. I mean, as a young undergraduate. And then come along postmodernism to try to find some way of doing this. At least one school of postmodernism. There are two or three schools of postmodernism, but it comes down basically to two. And let me go through these. So, postmodernism is also truth with a little t, that you can't be sure of what's true. It also tends to be dialogic, which means it's a matter of very conversational and working out, moving towards what might be true. And it also tends to be political. Now, that doesn't mean that modernism and pre-modernism are not political. They are also political. In fact, politicians use pre-modernism when it's popular to do so. They'll attack modernism. That's what is going on in the United States right now, that the politicians are attacking modernism because a lot of people who are still pre-modernist were very uncomfortable with modernism during COVID. So it's become popular to put that down. And the attack going on now against even universities who are doing the backbone of hypothetical empirical research is the universities. The hospitals you go to are using those results, but the thinking process, the epistemologies, is almost totally in universities, and they're being attacked like crazy by politicians who appeal to pre-modernists. It's like, hey, we'll take care of you. Just go with us, and we'll attack those modernists. Okay, going back to postmodernism, get a little t, a little d, dialogic, that means conversation, and political. It almost seems like, they got these three things going on, and they're all mild. Similar to modernism, this is manually accessed. It requires some thought process, it requires some involvement. It's just not automatically handed down from one generation to another. It's one generation at a time, and it's done manually. On the other hand, it's also a little bit automatically accessed the way pre-modernism was. In other words, it's created in the way modernism creates, but once it's created, it tends to be accessed the way pre-modernism was. It means it gets communicated from one person to another, and if it seems to be useful, then it's adopted for the time being. Here are some of the upsides. It's intuitive and rational, both. It involves both. Intuition is really important. It gives you a hunch, helps you develop hypotheses, and then it's rational in that it wants to test them in your own personal life. You don't just accept the word of the therapist, for instance, or the word of the doctor. It's rational. You want rationality with it, but it's also intuitive. It's also may not be as useful in an objective sense as modernism, but it's socially useful. It's socially useful because it's inclusive. Everybody can join the conversation. It promotes the idea of everybody has a voice. Everybody gets to talk about this. Everybody is involved in the process. It privileges, however, as does pre-modernism, local dialogue, not just what the most educated say, or not just the people who are in your particular group. It's socially useful and inclusive, and it privileges the local dialogue. So it means that what's happening at the dinner table is real important. What happens in the family is real important. The way you're going to get the wisdom to manage anxiety and be creative at the same time is coming from your experience with local people, the people that you're involved with, the people that love you and care about you, as well as others, because it also promotes a wider conversation. That's what dialogue is about and political about. You've got to go away just from your family and be involved with other people. And it promotes the tolerance of ambiguity in order to do that. In other words, the tolerance of ambiguity really has to do with, okay, I have an epistemology. It feels good, but I can't be sure that it represents reality. It's working for me right now, but I also not sure about it. It's probably congruent with reality, but it may not be, but it's working for me now. So I'm tolerating ambiguity. I'm not saying it has to be one way or the other, or it's the highway, one way or my way or the highway. I'm tolerating ambiguity. It's essential. If I practice the postmodernism, I'm going to be tolerating ambiguity, generally speaking. But remember, that's why I have this one, two, three on the slide. Some, in each of these, one would be the conservative, and three would be the elements of change in each one of these. So these are dynamic phenomena. They are ever changing and ever interacting in the ways that I'm describing. There's not one thing that is, and that's true of pre-modernism, of postmodernism also. But postmodernism tends to thrive off of that to a certain extent. Well, let me just go ahead and mention there tends to be, at least in my education, there's been two dominant ways of looking. There's the French school and the German school. And the French school tends to be more conservative, more authoritative, if not authoritarian, at least authoritative, and basically very much more political. It sees it sees it basically hypothesizes if at all possible, one group of people are going to be hurting, taking advantage of another group, and you need to follow the money or follow the power to find out what's really going on. This is the Michel Foucault part. This is the Foucault part of postmodernism, and it's intense. It's not very, it's tolerant. It doesn't tolerate ambiguity as much, and it's really about taking a stand. And it tends to be extremely political. The German school, the Frankfurt school, a guy named Habermas is the primary spokesman, and his primary bottom line is about dialogue. Keep the dialogue going. Keep it going. Don't involve yourself in dialogue to the point that you're cutting off input and other people having a chance to be involved in it. Get people involved in talking, talking, talking. Even if you have to take action, when I first came across this, I was reminded of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, because Hamlet is constantly talking and talking and talking to his friends and internally, and he never gets anything done until finally he experiences chaos and most of the people are killed instead of just his uncle. So is that really a good thing to do? Well, I've come to the conclusion it is because the stakes are so high. You know, the stakes are so high, socially and political, that keep the dialogue going is real important. Keep Republicans and Democrats talking to each other. Keep it going. Now, there are downsides also for postmodernism. It's at risk for irrationalism. It's at risk for people going off the debt, coming up so much with their own personal, private view of reality that they're incredibly irrational about it. They don't move back and forth between modernism and pre-modernism. They believe and feel they have a truth, and you better buy it. It's kind of a new pre-modernism, except it's postmodernism. And we have a lot of that, and social media has just, gone to town with this kind of thing, and it's I've withdrawn from it almost myself, and it tends to not care about empiricism anymore. I mean, it's throwing it out, the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. It gets into ideological extremism. It also can get into political correctness. It can do both. Some of what's going on in today's American politics is the backlash against political correctness, but doing it in such an extreme way that it's creating another kind of correctness. And it's not doing what Habermas is calling for, which I'm very attracted to. Let's keep the dialogue going. Of course, you have to take action. Of course, action is required, which Hamlet didn't seem to do it till the end of it. At any moment in time, you have to build a bridge, you have to create a structure, you have to do this and what have you. You do those things knowing that you're not sure that you should be doing them, or that you might not know exactly the way to do them, but you make it as safe as possible. But you keep the dialogue going. So criticism of what you're doing is welcomed. So the dialogue is always going on. You have dialogue at various levels instead of a hierarchy, like in a university. The students talk to the professors talk to the chair talks to the vice president talks to the president talks to the board, and these conversations go up and down, and they're welcomed. The idea is they're welcomed. So the student walking into the office of the provost or the president is welcomed. Now, maybe time and circumstances would seem otherwise. You have to get appointments and what have you, but it's still welcomed. That's a university worth teaching at. That's a university that way. That is the essence, the best part of postmodernism. So the downside I mentioned, well, I'm through that. So the idea is in your life, first of all, you have to live and be neighbors with, and you have to work with and have clients from any one of these epistemologies. It's not possible to do anything without encountering these. And then what about yourself? Which one do you feel you fit with the most? Well, that's what I'm hoping you discuss in your groups. Do you tend to live and work in one epistemology to the exclusion of the others? Or do you perhaps live in one but work in the other? Do you find your choices more often than not similar or different from that of your colleagues, customers, friends, family members, customers meaning clients? Does this similarity or difference impact the manner or efficiency of how you manage your own anxiety? So, however you're doing the first two, however you're managing the differences and the challenges of an epistemological nature, these are cultural phenomena. How does how you do it impact your own way of managing anxiety? How efficient is it in your life? That is what I'm hoping you discuss. And so you're basically discussing this discussion could be useful. And when you're talking about therapists burning out, it's a popular topic to meet and have groups about and what have you, is burnout. What role does conflicting epistemologies play in burnout? Does it drive you crazy a little bit to that you have to totally endorse empirical, ways of practicing, less intuitive, perhaps, less systemic, maybe, but empirical. And at the same time, you're supposed to feign acceptance of everybody else's, otherwise you can't keep your job or can't be hired. How does all that work? How do you handle those kind of things, those inconsistencies? I hope you, I hope you will look at that. And in my lifetime, never has the conflict in epistemologies been so severe on a social level as they are right now in the United States. I mean, our last election was almost determined by unresolved conflicts of epistemology. And starting, very early on when the debates about when Roe versus Wade, you didn't, the people who were pro-life, I'm just giving an example, the pro-life, which I am, and which I'm not, I'm pro-choice, but they were the people who were pro-choice were calling I mean, pro-life were calling pro-choice people murderers, and people who were pro-choice were telling the other people that they were just wanting to control women's bodies. I mean, there's such extremism, and and it's amazing to me that how they're going to talk to each other if they take these extreme positions. People were not trying to control women's bodies. They were tolerating it's like a collateral damage. They were tolerating the collateral damage for a spiritual reason that they believed, it was pre-modernistic based that to have an abortion or something was to take a life. They couldn't understand why anybody would uh, would would badmouth them for that or disagree with them, but they felt good about it because their epistemology was that they weren't they didn't they probably wished they didn't have to control women's body in order to do that. It's like collateral damage in war. So when you accidentally have to kill other people in order to kill the enemy and what have you, you know, yeah, I'm assuming you're familiar with that in history when the Allies in the firebombing of Dresden, was or even the bombing of Hiroshima, and that was on borderline decisions about those were not military targets; they were civilians. But the whole idea was they would break the will to fight, which it did. So it had pragmatic value, but it was also killing so many people. But the war would have gone on. These things are not easy questions, but to stay in dialogue with them is what postmodern has to offer. Let's stay talking to each other. Don't cut off talking. Don't just go to your corners and just talk to the people who are in the same epistemology as you are. Keep dialogue open. I hope that's what I believe in. That's my epistemology to keep dialogue open. Okay, I think that will leave you. I just want to leave you with one idea, one simple idea of an example of a disconnect between adherents of different. The primary meta concept in the natural and social sciences regarding life on this planet derives from the large umbrella theory of evolutionary theory, as has this lecture. Fareed Zakawi, who's my favorite news person, uh, he said this in November of 2015 during the upcoming election. He said 98% of professional scientists believe in the theory of evolution, so much so that the majority of these simply use the term evolution, they don't use the theory of evolution, which means that they think of it as a fact. Well, obviously, a postmodernist is going to think of it as a theory. But like people who go to work every day in a lab or something, or tend to, most medical doctors I've met tend to think in terms of facts, not theories. But only 65% of the population does in the United States believe that their theory of evolution is an accurate description of how we got here. And not one person among all the 17 at the time he did this, of those running for the Republican nomination for president at the time, would confirm their belief in the theory of evolution. So that represents a conflict in epistemology. That is what I'm talking about. So whatever you believe, keep the dialogue going, and I hope that's what you'll do right now in small groups, and I hope you enjoy doing that. What else can I say? So Dr. Souza will take it away. Okay, bye bye.